First order of business, we gotta cleanse the space. Let's light some white sage in here. Let it burn. There we go. Cleanse this space, please. Oh, that smells nice. We got incense, we got coffee. What else do we need? Nothing. Oh, let's do it. Hello, and welcome to the Catella Bubble, where I, Catella, discuss the British royal family, UK politics, the media, etc., etc. Here we like to tackle the big questions like, is Prince William trying to metaphorically stab his father in the back? And if Brits wake up to republicanism, can we have a town hall style debate between Republic UK CEO Graham Smith and King Charles III? Or in other words, will the revolution be televised? Oh yeah, that's right. But anyway, that's not really the point of today's video, which is part 2 of my deep dive / review into Omid Scobie's unprecedented and unique royal biography, Endgame, which is behind me right here. There, right here. Before we jump in, make sure you give this a like, make sure you write a comment, click subscribe, click the little bell icon. Do all of those things to show that you want to hear my thoughts, my opinions on all of these topics, and just help the channel out, help me out, help this grow. The more I feel like people are listening to these things, the more likely I'm gonna want to devote all my extra time outside of working in public education to deliver content to you. If you want to hear part 1, where I go into my overall thoughts on the author, Omid Scobie, overall themes of the book, and a breakdown of the first 7 chapters, link is down below and around here somewhere, so go check that out. This video, I've decided to focus on chapters 8 through 11 and leave chapters 12 through 15 for a part 3. This is where the book starts to get juicy, so I don't want to feel like I'm rushing through it. Also, my public education job is catching up to me, and I just don't have the time right now, I'm sorry. The second half of the book is where I think Omid Scobie's thesis really clicks into place as well. In the first half of the book, Scobie really focused on the past failures of the monarchy. Examples really focused on Prince, now King Charles, and his greediness, Prince Andrew and his alleged licentiousness, and all of the chaos and negativity from the Harry and Meghan situation, which has highlighted a lot of racial and class tensions that extend beyond a few bad apples in the firm. We get a little bit more of that as we transition into the midpoint of the book, but as it focuses more on William and Harry, I think it gives us more of a glimpse into the personalities at play, especially as we move towards King William V times. And listen, we'll talk about like the whole King Charles being diagnosed with cancer thing. Like, I know that this might seem like a little bit callous now, but like, yeah, it's coming. King William V is coming. But the second half of Endgame focuses more of its attention on the younger members of the family, which represents more of the direction that the firm is going to move into in the future. Charles is stubborn and dated, but there is only so much longer that his reign is going to last, given his age and his health status. The true players in the metaphorical chess endgame are the ones that are gonna stick around the longest and have whole lifetimes of strategizing and maneuvering to do. In this way, William and Harry, in some ways, not always, but in some, sort of represent two sides of the chess game, but in other ways also represent the possibility of working in tandem in the monarchy's winning endgame. I May Have a Point on TikTok had a great way of describing William, Kate, Harry, and Meghan's playstyles in this chess metaphor that I absolutely adored.
Among the other pieces on a chessboard is the bishop, which stands close to the king and queen and is considered the third most powerful piece on the board. However, the bishop is limited in movement, only able to move one direction. And according to Omid, William also only seems able to move in one direction, toward the crown. The bishops may stand close to the king and queen on the chessboard, but there are actually pieces that are more powerful. The rooks are physically removed from the king and queen, standing near the outer edges of the board, but their power lies in their ability to do something the bishop cannot, and that is take out the king. Harry, too, finds himself physically removed from the king and queen, and like the rook, perhaps in a more advantageous position, able to move in more directions than the somewhat locked-in bishop. When he deems it necessary, Harry is able to fall back into his royal role, standing vigil over the Queen's coffin and popping in for the coronation. but he's also been able to break out on his own, living his life on his terms and focusing on the causes that mean so much to him, like the military, mental health, and taking on the media. At this point, Harry has nothing to lose when it comes to taking on both the UK media and the firm. He's financially independent and fiercely protective of his wife and children.
I think it's something very thoughtful to consider while reading chapters 8 and 9, which are respectively about William and Harry. I also think you should be tuned into a theme that permeates the rest of the book. There are multiple times that those close to or in the institution show their hand and claim that such and such a thing is bad because it would be the end of the monarchy. And just sit with that for a moment, because my most obvious question would be to dispute the accidental claim in those statements. A bit of a slip of the mask, if you will. Why is the end of the monarchy a bad thing? If you literally take nothing else away from this channel, monarchies, especially British Royal Family Incorporated, have a boatload of problems and things for which they can be critiqued. So we need to put aside talking about these people as celebrities for a moment. This man, King Charles, and his family are the head of state. Ceremonial, blah, blah. I'm not buying that. But this man is the head of state of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. He's the king in kingdom. So I think our ears should perk up a little bit when we hear people in the palace inner circle, especially going out to the media, trying to get casual viewers to just agree blindly to the implicit claim that the monarchy is inherently good and that dissolving the monarchy is inherently bad. It's just literally an argument that would not work in any other independent democratic nation. I'm sorry, especially for my American ass, where I have learned way too much about the American Revolution since I live in the New England area. No, it's not gonna work. Britain, there's a reason we left. This argument pops up in such strange places too. They seem to really associate this argument with Harry and Meghan, who are, unfortunately, not anti-monarchists. As much as I would like them to be, they are not. They're not anti-monarchists. Listen, I'm disheartened too. So many little comments that are already pointing fingers at Harry and Meghan if the entire institution of the monarchy disappears, which would sound less nefarious anyway if instead of framing it as the end of the monarchy, if you instead just said, adopt a constitution in which the monarch is no longer the head of state and had a clear declaration of rights. But it doesn't matter anyway, because Harry and Meghan have publicly said that they are not anti-monarchists, and their behaviors and actions outside of any conspiracy-brained interpretation of them point to them being, boring neoliberal capitalists. There are worse crimes in the world. Now, I, separate from Scobie, separate from Harry and Meghan, am obviously an anti-monarchist. But that's neither here nor there. Pointing to Harry and Meghan as the scapegoats for democracy, it's weird. And it doesn't reflect reality. If you're going to point the blame on anybody, blame it on me. At least I am an anti-monarchist. But I don't think I'm bringing it down anytime soon. Scobie points directly to a growing populist movement, different ways that the political winds are blowing, and a host of different factors for why the monarchy is in this current endgame. I think all of those factors are all way more relevant than whether or not Harry and Meghan decide to live their best life on the final end stages of the monarchy itself. I find it interesting as well that as we pivot into the second half of the book, Omid discusses some of the other ways in which things are quickly shifting behind palace walls. We'll see in chapter 10 how Scobie, in one of the more historically dense chapters, considers the modern role of courtiers and how massive, even on a psychological level, they will have on the future of the monarchy. Though you'd consider chapter 11, Princess Diana and Revisionist History, movie to be a step backward, looking again at previous failures of the institution, I found rather that it really was a look at the future of how Diana fits into the royal narrative. How the family felt about Diana in her life, and how they have used her still popular and heart-wrenching legacy in death are two different things. Now that there's been more distance placed between Diana's death and the current day, Scobie is really examining how the institution is once again reshifting the narrative now that Diana's real story might not suit them. Before we dive into those 4 chapters, I just want to take a little moment to acknowledge King Charles's cancer diagnosis. Right now, the palace is acting like it's not that serious. I know Kate Middleton has also been hospitalized. Maybe it seems like she's recovering at home now. I don't know. Obviously, I didn't know that while writing the script. Omid obviously didn't know that while writing the book. I'm just not going to talk about either of those things in this episode. If you want me to talk about those things in like another like short bonus show, go ahead, leave a comment. But just like keep that in mind. If I'm like callous about the possibility of Charles dying soon and William inheriting the throne, it's not meant to be dark humor unless you want it to be. And with all that, let's get into the book, shall we? Let's do it. Let's go. Chapter 8. Gloves on. Prince William, heir to the throne. This chapter gives us a puzzling but wonderfully complex look at Prince William, who, with all the most recent shakeups in the firm, has started to seize more opportunities to assert and project himself as a leader in preparation for his future reign, now that it has been brought into sharper focus. Scobie writes that William seems to be, quote, motivated by both justified anger and atonement for the monarchy's recent blunders, to become a, quote, new face for the monarchy. In recent years, he's tried to use his sleeker, more modern seeming project like Earthshot Prize, or being the Football Association president, being president of the BAFTAs, as a way to express that he is unique from the rest of his family. He has used these platforms to pay lip service to DEI, for example, such as writing that he was, quote, deeply concerned about racial abuse young players suffered during youth football matches, and he was, quote, sickened by racial abuse hurled at players who did the penalty kicks for the 2020 Euros. I literally just wrote insert joke here about the Women's World Cup fiasco. I guess put the joke here. I mean, this is the joke. Also, when it was trendy to call out the BAFTA awards in the wake of hashtag Oscars so white for not having a diverse set of nominees and films, William again talked about how the BAFTAs should do better and the, quote, need to do more to ensure diversity in the sector. But what Scobie notes, which I find special, is, quote, while the royal institution has an embarrassingly poor record overall when it comes to racial issues, these organizations in which William holds honorary roles can't afford to be seen as uninterested or unengaged, meaning the prince can't sit back in silence like other family members, which highlights that William is indeed in a unique position. The rest of the family is in some ways quite keen to keep all their racist baggage. They whine and cry sometimes when people call them out for being racist, but they don't really seem to care if they are perceived in that way. Whether or not it's because they are die-hard racists is kind of irrelevant and it's a bit complicated, but they seem to have no real grasp on how taboo outward racism is to the public at large. I think they're savvy enough to know not to say the N-word in public, but other than that, I think it's more them being out of touch than them really wanting to die hard outwardly support institutions of racism. Although that's definitely part of it too. But William is not like that. Being associated with football or movies and television, these modern industries that are meant to be tapped into the zeitgeist and meant to respond to public discourse, they cannot afford to just be silent on race issues or LGBT issues. These industries are very used to doing the bare minimum public responses, little things to seem like they are doing something to address these systemic problems. The royal family has never been an institution that has felt the need to engage with public dialogue in this way. They think that they are superior, they are awesome, they are the best. They will maybe do things to appease the masses so that they don't get their heads cut off, but they rarely tap into the public discourse. Probably because they fear that the public discourse is, quote, too political, even though literally everything that the monarchy does is political. And thus, William has kind of learned, faster than other people in his family, where the PR of the firm has to progress into the future. For him, this makes life incredibly frustrating, as in cases like taking Prince Andrew's titles away, or trying to do some damage control with the, quote, very much not a racist family line, or the Lady Susan Hussey scandal. He probably feels like he is one of the only sane men left in the control room. There is literally only Charles and all of his sycophants making large-scale decisions about whole family PR response. And Scobie kind of hints that this has been the case even before the Queen passed away. And this seems to be one of the major issues that has created tension between father and son. An old vanguard of PR that is woefully out of touch with what most companies, most institutions are doing, and William, who actually has some connection to reality. Another example of William trying to project modern statesman energy is when he visited Israel and Palestine in 2018. Quote, in a speech, William told the people of Palestine they, quote, have not been forgotten.
The story of the Palestinian people is so often told only through the lens of difficulty and conflict. But there is another story which I was privileged to witness today. This afternoon in Ramallah, I saw an unforgettable display of Palestinian culture and hospitality. My message tonight is that you have not been forgotten. It has been a very powerful experience to meet you and other Palestinians living in the West Bank and to hear your stories. I hope that through my being here and understanding the challenges you face, the links of friendship and mutual respect between the Palestinian and British people will grow stronger.
Since then, however, there has not been a further word from the prince or his team on the matter, even though violence between the two groups continues to escalate. I will say the Israel-Palestine conflict is one issue on which Brits on average are way more progressive than Americans. Since there's no Christian Zionism base in the UK, there's no religious connection really to the state of Israel, and historically, especially on college and university campuses, the Free Palestine movement has been much larger and more vocal in the UK than it has ever been in the US. Although we are seeing this change now with certain American campuses protesting. Currently, the UK's support of Israel during the current conflict is a lot more contentious and has caused a lot more heated debate in the UK than it does here with Biden's current support, although that might be changing. I think it's shifting a bit more as the Democratic Party becomes more and more left-leaning. But all of this to say, this speech from William was obviously cheap talk to make himself seem like he would be a more progressive modern king. But based on the fact that there has been very little follow-through on these so-called progressive words, like his talks about diversity, or mental health, or homelessness, it seems like he's mostly learned to talk the PR talk, but not how to put any of those progressive values into direct actions. Maybe this would be enough to trick some neolibs into thinking he's a progressive, but anyone that's actually a leftist, anyone that actually does follow progressive politics, we'll see right through this guy's garbage. There is also a more aggressive push from the institution to combat any negative stories about Prince William because his reputation is what the entire future of the crown depends on. Scobie shows that this is not necessarily new for Prince William, given how much he's been shielded from negative press coverage based on his heir status, even as a child or a teenager. But as an adult, it has reached new levels, especially with the Queen's passing and how it changes the line of succession. Scobie uses the example of the stories surrounding Rose Hanbury, Marioness of Cholmondeley. Scobie notes, for William, there was no take it on the chin advice like Meghan received during her media onslaughts. Rather, it was all hands on deck to protect William's reputation. Now, whether or not the rumors about William and Rose are true, at this point in time, they are irrelevant. What is more important is how the institution handled those rumors as opposed to numerous other rumors and falsities circulated about, say, Harry and Meghan due to William's status. This, despite the adultery story being the exact kind of salacious, juicy story that tabloids love to slurp up. Scobie notes that, quote, few British outlets and zero royal books have actually delved into the rumors surrounding the Waleses and the Marioness of Cholmondeley. How the gossip gained traction was thanks to another perplexing character in the royal family saga, GB News fail-son himself, Dan Wootton, who had a tumultuous year last year, ducking and dodging the work of the Byline Times investigators who uncovered his exploitative practices. I haven't talked much about Wootton on my channel. To be honest, I didn't really follow the investigation that closely, but the way that he has weaseled himself into being like a chaotic evil force within the royal establishment with his toxic media personality is kind of wild. I'm not going to get too wrapped up in the Rose Hanbury details, but one detail that jumped out to me was Omid mentioning that Rose used to be a, quote, political researcher for conservative politician Michael Gove? This was hilarious to me because Gove in the UK is like loathed by most Labour voters for, one, being caught in the MP expenses scandal to be paid for by the taxpayer. Two, pushing misinformation in the lead up to the Brexit vote.
Well, hold on, though, because we've got Full Fact, which is an independent organisation that checks the claims that are coming from both sides. And they say energy bills, if we look at that in particular, because that's what you're talking about, could go up if we leave because of uncertainty in the market. So they could be going up anyway as a consequence of leaving.
Well, and it could go down as well as a consequence of some of the other changes that we might make once we've taken back control. The critical thing is, one thing you can be certain of, if we leave the European Union, we will have millions more to spend on our priorities, and we'll be able to reduce VAT.
3, as education secretary, overhauling British education to the point that the teachers union criticized him. 4, going on TV and saying, quote, in relation to what policy should look like in Britain, which is probably like the most anti-intellectual take I have ever heard. And they think us Americans are anti-intellectual. That was like the most hilarious thing. And 5, doing a Hillary and having a private email server that circumvented FOIA, along with a bunch of other shit. He's also married to Sarah Vine, who many in the royal commentary sphere will recognize as a Daily Mail columnist who often writes about the royals. So, small world. Speaking of the Daily Mail, Scobie talks about how they tried to spin these negative adultery rumors into a fight about the monarchy itself, which to me is kind of baffling because it totally tells on themselves. Scobie writes, quote, the paper's palace-friendly columnist, Richard Kay, reported that Kate had not fallen out with Rose and was, quote, the real victim of aristocratic dinner party gossip. The extraordinary rumors were simply, quote, grist to the mill for the cause of republicanism, bringing a glow to the hearts of anti-monarchists everywhere. Fascinating to me that they would try to spin it this way. People want to take the monarchy down. That's why all these privileged aristocrats are gossiping about an affair. so that those aristocrats can start the revolution. Sure, Jan. Like, literally, it just doesn't even make any sense. You can't say in one breath that it's a bunch of aristocratic gossip, and then on the other hand, make the claim that it's some sort of anti-monarchist propaganda campaign. Pick a lane. Like, not only was there tons of effort to discredit this story in a multitude of ways, Scobie writes, quote, "In fact, it was during this run of Rose stories that the Sussexes, who started their own separate office at Buckingham Palace in the middle of the gossip run, noticed an uptick in negative or revealing stories about themselves in the Mail and the Sun. Funny how it's back on us," one of the couple's palace staff told me at the time. Harry even wondered if someone at the palace had helped move certain journalists onto other stories and away from the Rose gossip. He would later find out he was right. It was the same old story playing out with much greater intensity. William's reputation is under threat, so Harry became the sacrificial lamb in order to protect the next king at all costs. Except now, rather than just throwing Harry under the bus, they also threw Meghan under the bus, and that throwing also included racialized abuse and harassment. The heir-spare dynamic in that moment reached a height that I think was new for both brothers. With such a massive accusation, with huge implications, especially with the Charles-Diana story looming in the background, the dirty tricks to make that story go away resulted in even more damaging consequences for Harry and his family than it might have had in years past. Scobie writes later in the chapter, quote, "As he gets close to the top job, in addition to his temper, there's a colder side to him that some friends and also his brother Harry have described. I think in order for William to hurt these personal familial relationships in the way that he has, he must be a bit colder and more calculating than he was in his youth. This might make him a better company man, a phrase that comes up quite a few times in the book, but it could cost him the modicum of charisma he might have previously possessed, which might have endeared him to the public as a leader. I think it's that contrast between the leader that William is more and more trying to project and his slow hollowing as a person is working against him in achieving the goal that he has. And as Scobie notes later on, time does heal wounds, but it also hardens grudges, particularly when you've got an entire institution to validate and back your resentment and anger. I think this is also true of William's belief, which he's expressed in a few different forms, that his brother has been, quote, brainwashed by therapists. The institution and its PR arms are happy to brief those ideas to the press and therefore validate them to William. Scobie gives an example. There were leaks to reporters that William and other family members, including Camilla, covertly sanctioned. The Independent claimed that the family feels Harry was, quote, kidnapped by a cult of psychotherapists. Absolutely hilarious considering the monarchy is a cult. Like literally a cult. Whatever. Overall, the picture that Omid paints of William is that of someone trying to craft a squeaky clean, if not bland, image both of himself and for the future of the institution. He knows for the most part what to say in order to stay out of trouble. He's not the progressive he's claiming to be, which is obvious to anyone that engages with his actions with a critical eye, but he is at least not a gigantic PR liability, unlike some members of his family. However, we are seeing him become a little more colder as he ages and willing to act in more and more cutthroat ways against his father and brother. He has, just like his father before him, completely swallowed all indoctrination that his reputation and his image are of utmost importance to the monarchy's brand. And thus it'll be interesting to see in the metaphorical endgame if he will become more Machiavellian in his power plays based on his current behaviors. But William is not alone in the family, as much as he might want that to be the case. Which leads us to... On the other side of the coin, we have Harry. The focus of Chapter 9, Gloves Off. Though this chapter, of course, does touch on a lot of things that have already been covered to death in the royal commentary sphere, and which I've already covered in previous other videos, I think what I appreciated was that Omid Scobie continued to echo the sentiment that both Harry and Meghan are being frozen out of the royal establishment. It's something that, of course, plays a big role in Prince Harry's spare, but it's interesting to gain another perspective on it. As with any royal biography, you can make the argument that maybe these sources aren't verified and blah, 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 but overall, the sources quoted seem to agree that it is intentional how the Sussexes are being treated by the firm. The excuses that the palace gives for its behavior when it comes to issues dealing with Harry and Meghan are very flimsy, and it's pretty obvious that they are just riding a wave of public vitriol against the couple. At the start of Chapter 9, Scobie notes that in late 2022, with the Netflix documentary and Spare creating buzz around Harry and Meghan, quote, family members and palace officials were also doing their best to keep the couple at arm's length and out of the loop. On top of this, it's clear that the unofficial PR arms of the family use the familial strife to push misinformation against the Sussexes. You know, the same thing that they were doing when the couple was still living in the UK. So nothing has changed. Quote, indeed, newspaper articles and royal commentary ranged from cruel to completely made up. One commentator, well known for her fictitious ramblings and out-of-pocket conspiracy theories, used a Sky News broadcast about the Queen's life to falsely claim that the couple would be wearing microphones and secret cameras to record their encounters with members of the royal family for future Netflix projects. The obvious example of this out-of-the-loop policy is how the family treated the death of the Queen and the lack of communication between Harry and Meghan's team, the palace, and the family members themselves. The petty grudges meant that Harry was denied news about the passing of his own grandmother. Quote, when William and the others landed at 3:50 p.m. to discover the news that the Queen had passed away at 3:10 p.m., Harry still had no idea what was going on when his own plane finally took off at 5:35 p.m. Clearly, Charles knew that this was a bad look for him. As Omid notes, quote, palace sources later briefed certain papers that Charles had personally shared the news with his younger son, but this was just a move to save face. Another great example of this freezing out comes at the end of the chapter. One key issue Harry and Meghan highlighted in their Oprah interview, which they seemed to have used as their sort of royal family exit interview, was how they felt like their children were not being treated like other previous children born into the royal family.
They didn't want him to be a prince or a princess, not knowing what the gender would be, which would be different from protocol, and that he wasn't going to receive security.
What?
It was really hard.
This ranged from comments and concerns on Archie's skin color to how the family discussed not giving them titles, which could also result from their children not receiving security by the institution. Scobie notes that the family still seems keen to continue this poor treatment even after the Sussex departure. Quote, some events of the past still hurt today, particularly those involving their children, Archie and Lilibet. Although convention dictates that the two should have automatically become prince and princess when the king acceded to the throne, it took Buckingham Palace 6 months to finally confirm the title changes. Charles had initially avoided the subject, but eventually told Harry in early 2023 that he would, quote, make it official if they wanted it. They did, but uttered no further word on it until the press secretary casually informed the couple's team a month later that a change would be made. The palace blamed the delay on the site's periodic update schedule, but refused to explain why they didn't just change the children's titles at the same time as publishing William and Kate's new Wales titles in September 2022. It is obvious to this day, the sore spots the institution has with the Harry and Meghan issue are as fresh as they were nearly 4 to 5 years ago. It's clear that the dogma of the monarchy is that Harry and Meghan's presence cannot be acknowledged unless it is to denigrate them in the press. The contentions that they've had long ago, especially surrounding those children, is here to stay. Keep in mind, shortly after this book was published, the British media, clearly tacitly endorsed by the palace, considering the royal commentators involved, decided to claim with no clear evidence whatsoever that Queen Elizabeth secretly hated her granddaughter's name. Jumping back to earlier in the chapter though, this treatment of Harry and Meghan as being out of the loop kind of led to some scary situation. When William, Kate, Harry, and Meghan were scheduled to parade out on the long walk at Windsor Castle, Harry and Meghan were not informed that it was to be an official walkabout. This even with William and Kate being in the car with them prior. They are receiving a grown-up silent treatment. They seem to have made some small talk, which in Britain might as well be silence, but they don't communicate any actual useful information. Quote, "And then a feeling of discomfort and reluctancy set in as Harry and Meghan caught a glimpse of the photographers and video cameras ready to capture their arrival as a group of 4. They knew there would be members of the public gathered, but this was the first time they knew of an official media presence. Kensington Palace, they later found out, had tipped off a select group of people. You might be forgiven for thinking, well, what's the big idea? Sometimes there's paparazzi or unscheduled photographers. But there's a few issues with this little detail. Firstly, I find that Will's and Kate's team being the ones to tip off the media aligns perfectly with other examples of photographers showing up to events with the couple that were supposedly unplanned. It intrigues me that they kind of knew that the press was meant to be favorable to them. Maybe somehow William and Kate didn't know that, and their comms teams did that independently, but that seems like a stretch. Coupled with later briefing about the event, such as, quote, "Close sources told King Charles's biographer Robert Jobson that Kate admitted to a family member that, quote, it was one of the hardest things she ever had to do because of the acrimony between the two couples." Seems from the get-go that William and Kate's team wanted this walk to be about them all the way through the planning process, and continued to use this very normal, totally boring walk to generate good PR about themselves out of literally nothing. Like they didn't do anything except walk, move their legs, one foot in front of the other. Second, for a few reasons. Scobie notes, quote, "Sources said Meghan was extremely nervous about being in front of the crowds. By this point, the couple's rapidly declining popularity in the United Kingdom was an inarguable fact. The level of vitriol aimed at Meghan in particular, whether online or in the newspapers, was worse than ever. Armed royal protection officers were on high alert, and so was she." So not only does this show that the family is petty, the family is so petty that they are willing to put their own family members in danger. Great. That sounds absolutely medieval, because this institution is literally medieval. A lot of this chapter also focuses on Harry's goal of tackling dirty press tricks like illegal information gathering, with his numerous lawsuits against UK tabloids who used such tactics against him in his youth. Because of his father being the primary controller of the family's PR strategies, this seems to be the most difficult contention between Harry and Charles. Scobie writes, quote, "A source close to the family said Charles's office has very much ruled the roost when it comes to the relationship with the media. The Queen was doing her best to ensure that everybody was working in harmony, but Clarence House had a long-term strategy." As we know from other sources, and reiterated here in Endgame, this long-term strategy included some of the very practices which Harry is fighting in his lawsuits, such as the alleged secret agreement between Clarence House and Murdoch executives, quote, "that promised that royal victims of phone hacking, including the brothers, would receive a settlement and an apology when all the publisher's other major phone hacking cases had concluded. But as we know, this deal was not upheld by Murdoch's team, and Charles's team's strategies seemed to be to let the deal go by negotiating settlements with various tabloids, like William's £1 million settlement with Newsgroup newspapers. In Charles's mind, allowing his boys to go through with their original plan to put in claims against the Sun could have jeopardized his relationships, which he had built to legitimize Camilla's ascension to the role as queen consort. This makes clear, however, to Harry that his well-being was never put to the forefront of these PR strategies. As an adult, it's clear that Harry is trying to take back some agency which he was denied in his youth in regards to his treatment by the media. And he shows passion when discussing his, quote, life's mission to work towards shining a light on the topic through these litigations. Quote, Harry hopes that his actions will simply lead to finding some solutions for improving media practices, that at some point, those in the British government, including the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, will push for a substantive overhaul. With a switch to a Labour government looking likely in 2024, after the Conservative Party, largely supported by media barons who control most of the country's papers, have been in power since 2010, that could happen. He also mentions that they seem to be moving in the direction of working to, quote, build a better online world through some of their newer projects, which I think is pretty good branding of their story, while also moving away from the family soap opera angle. Though Scobie is also willing to criticize the Sussexes' rocky start to their independent life from the royal family, such as, quote, the true purpose and mission for their charitable vehicle is still not completely clear, and their Spotify deal seemingly falling through due to some creative differences between the media company and the couple's vision for their content creation. I think a source Omid quotes is also right on the money when they say, quote, the Netflix documentary and Spare projects kept them immersed in an old chapter of their lives during the new one for longer than was ideal. I think they expected that they could just drop their 2 cents and be done with the family, but the unexpected death of the Queen, leading into Charles's coronation and the beginning of a new era, meant that the media cycle surrounding their betrayal of the family dragged on for nearly half a year. It's clear based on how little they've spoken as of late and how they seem quite strategic with their most recent public appearances. The Sussexes are trying to move past the freezing out that they've suffered at the hands of their family. And good for them. Good for them. I'm proud of them. Good for them. I'm kind of tired of talking about them too, honestly. We've got way too much criticism of the monarchy to get to, which segues into New Day, New Coffee. Oh, that's good. Chapter 10. The Men and Women in Grey. Royal Courtiers and the Struggle for Power. This chapter starts off as sort of historically dense, more so as an overarching narrative about courtiers rather than name dropping. It's a unique claim presented in the book about the role that courtiers play in how the institution operates. But it's also one that has sort of the least amount of modern evidence presented. Scobie uses sort of 3 modern case studies, and there is some speculation as to the role that they played in serving different principles like the Queen, Charles, and William. But I also wonder if not a lot of evidence is presented because of the legal issues with revealing too much. But even still, I find this chapter really intriguing, and it's one of the few in which Scobie actively encourages the reader to do more research with other people's books. Scobie's main thesis is that the job description of a royal courtier throughout the centuries has changed very little, and that by extrapolation, we can see that perhaps today, those working in the palace still maintain a power and control over the machinations of the institution as they have had throughout its entire history. Scobie clarifies, and I think this is good because the word courtier is so archaic in a way, that, quote, the label of courtier is synonymous with palace aide, and it broadly applies to those who work in royal communications or serve as private secretaries, estate managers, equerries, event coordinators, ladies of the household, dressers, valets, and much more. More narrowly, though, the term courtier is most often linked to press officials and private secretaries. And that last part is especially true when it's correspondents or other media figures talking about courtiers within the royal household. Omid also writes, quote, "You may not see a courtier donning a feathered bonnet or carrying a scrolled message in the 21st century, but King Charles and Prince William continued the tradition of dispatching loyal aides to announce, arrange, fix, and at times provoke. Now they're professionally trained and, in some cases, groomed for the job." I was particularly struck by that use of the word groomed, as a lot of the institution of the monarchy relies on grooming people for the roles within it. For the family, of course, the heirs to the throne are groomed to later take on the responsibilities of the crown, to adhere to certain philosophies and beliefs, which are conducive to fulfilling that role. But courtiers, supposedly birthed at lower ranks, are also often groomed into their roles as well, leading in a lot of ways to what I've previously discussed as cult-like thinking. The system is not to be questioned. The system has a role, a destiny for the members born within its confines, and it places at birth a hierarchy. Why does William become the heir? Because it's his destiny at birth. Why does a courtier that has a position that is filled through some sort of hereditary tradition? Because it is their destiny at birth. This thinking is absolutely archaic, and most people will see on its face that this system is not conducive to believing in a true democracy and a concept of human rights and autonomy, but it's something that culturally just becomes tacitly accepted, which solidifies the cult-like thinking of those within the institution that what they are doing is right and just, even when it is literally grooming people for positions in the institution. And I think we can all say grooming is bad. Grooming is wrong. I was kind of struck by this in Burrell's memoir. It kind of describes getting a quick interview with the monarch with very little education when he was very young and with not a lot of work experience. And yet courtiers that can climb up the institutional ladder can become almost as influential, if not more influential, than any other government minister if they play their cards right. This also reminds me of a cult as well. Taking somebody that feels like they are very low down in the socioeconomic hierarchy of the culture and offering, if you play your cards right, if you do exactly what we tell you to do, if you suck up to us, then you can gain access to power and influence over others, which can be tantalizing to young, ignorant people that oftentimes feel like they are powerless and lack any influence in their culture or community. Scobie gives a fascinating example of Angela Kelly, who was the late Queen's personal assistant. Although I think personal assistant makes it sound a lot more corporate, because courtiers in the royal family, as we've seen with the Michael Fawcett example as well, are not clocking off like regular workers. Scobie writes of Kelly, quote, "She was one of the first and few to know about and keep the secret of the Queen's health diagnosis and related struggles. Kelly was also a shoulder to cry on, often sitting with the Queen for hours at a time after the death of her husband, Prince Philip. Charles is said to have never trusted Kelly, and after his mother's death, made one of his first acts as king to evict the 65-year-old from the Windsor Grace and Favor home the Queen had gifted to her." What is it with Charles and this evil landlord shtick? This is why you need a union, folks. You spent your entire life getting trauma dumped on by your boss, catering to her every whim and doing her dirty work for her, and then you get unceremoniously kicked out of the big happy family that you got invited into because the next guy in line didn't really like you that much. I don't know, it's definitely giving cult vibes. With courtiers, it really frustrates me that the royal family blurs the lines between worker and companions, friends, emotional support. There's a reason why your work and your personal life should have separation and some boundaries. It's not to say that you can't build relationships with workers or subordinates, but the environment that the royal family creates is not a normal work environment. It becomes one in which people lower up in the hierarchy must be entirely devoted and subservient to people higher up in the hierarchy. And to ask workers to put in that much emotional, mental, physical labor into their jobs because of some nonsensical belief that the principles that they are serving are somehow superior beings, that every whim and need for them must be catered to because they are inherently special or better than other human beings on this planet, makes for such an unhealthy workplace environment that it should really be concerning to people that a part of the government, the head of state, is able to control an institution like this that doesn't value its workers in a proper way, and instead thinks the way to create a working environment is to create a cult. Scobie even writes, quote, "The hours are long, the pay is often nothing to write home about. After all, it mostly comes from the public purse, and it can be a thankless position with minimal job security. Imagine the worst boss you have ever had. Now imagine that boss can fire you at literally any moment. Now imagine that boss will never be fired. Ever. That's the royal family." But what is most interesting about this chapter is how Omid talks about the new role for courtiers to act as almost misinformation, disinformation campaign leaders, to be part of propagating the fire hose of falsehood, like literally old Soviet propaganda techniques. This totally makes sense with how many bullshit articles are printed about the royal family every single day. Back in the day, maybe this could have been considered spin doctoring, but in the modern world where alternative facts reign supreme on the internet and in the general media ecosphere, this is a much scarier press climate. And the courtiers leading those campaigns also seem to be privately unsavory as well. This chapter also kind of has a key to unlock a little bit of the last part of Spare. Scobie goes through the bee, the fly, and the wasp as they're labeled in Prince Harry's book, but I'm going to tackle it in a bit of a different order because I think it's more interesting to look at it as examples of the Queen's courtiers, Charles's courtiers, and William's courtiers. Before the bee, or Edward Young, the Queen had a courtier named Christopher Guyte. Side note, he's a lord, so he's actually in the British government. Small world, I know. Scobie writes, quote, "Guyte was discreet, professional, and plugged into the circuit board of British politics. But he also seems to have drank the Kool-Aid, believing that the Queen was amazing and the best thing for the monarchy since sliced bread. And honestly, he might have been right about that. But because of this, he threatened Charles, who was, as we've seen time and time again, very eager to get his reign started before the Queen passed away. Quote, "Charles and his aides were eager to accelerate his activities and visibility by his 70th birthday in November 2018. Insiders called it Project 70, and the goal was to further position Charles as the king in waiting and show that a transition of power was already underway." Side note on the name Project 70, everything out of the weird nightmare Clarence House spin room sounds like it's out of like an ancient board meeting filled with like octogenarians who are like maybe friends with some 40-year-olds. Project 70 is like the stupidest fucking name, most corporate bullshittiest thing I've ever heard. But anyway, because of this petty grievance with Guyte not wanting to soft launch the new monarch, Charles got his predator brother, Andrew, to come down to meet with the Queen to convince her to fire this guy. Because of Charles's thirst for power and his desire to stop and remove all who were in his way in the climb to the top, he convinced his senile old mother to fire this guy. I think this is the most wild story because I don't understand the absolute power-hungry nature of Charles. He is literally a Nepo baby. He literally knew that he would be promoted to this job since he was in bloomers. It's the same thing I said about William earlier. It's like these people don't have to do Machiavellian maneuvering. They can literally just rest easy and wait for the previous guy to die. Nothing will change the line of succession. But the cutthroatness isn't to get the promotion. It's to get there unchallenged by anyone, with a differing opinion or moral compass, and therefore be able to take all the money and run, and promise a piece of the pie only to anyone that is willing to be a dutiful lackey. That's why I'm so concerned about the reigns of Charles and William, because we have not seen this kind of maneuvering in the monarchy for a long time. This is a quest to get more money, more power, more influence, and not being satisfied with simply being the head of state of a nation. Head of state of multiple nations, actually. Technically, the leader of 1/3 of the world's population. Quote, a Buckingham Palace insider said at the time, it was like something out of monarchies in the Middle Ages. Is it all that surprising? No. Is this something I would want to know if my head of state was doing? Hell yes. But it doesn't get reported in the same way as any other stupid drama in the family. And I think this is intentional. If we focused on the political machinations of courtiers and their principles, rather than family soap opera interpersonal drama, focus on that would become a political topic. It would unlock so many questions about how our government and our institutions should operate. Whereas interpersonal conflicts can have a lot of different sides to them and a lot of emotions attached to different positions and differences in opinion and beliefs. Once you start to unpack the role that unelected people play in how these institutions operate, it starts to bring up a lot more questions about democracy and the fact that the UK literally just does not have a democracy. And that is the scariest thing of them all. Moving on though, because of this wildness, Edward Young, who in Spare is called the Bee, was promoted to replace Guyt. The main contention from Harry in Spare seemed to be that Edward Young blocked a lot of communication and access to the Queen from Harry. You know, her grandson, her blood. But Scobie peels back a little bit more and says that within the sort of institutional wisdom, Young was, quote, an uninspired private secretary who lacked imagination, and that he is, quote, often blamed for a portion of the Sussex versus Palace fiasco, and yet also was, quote, a skilled liaison between the Queen, the government, and those who seek her favor. Because of the weird toxic workplace relationships at Buckingham Palace, seems like the Queen's main courtiers were, like most powerful courtiers, big kiss asses, but also strangely got to a point where they didn't see the Queen as like a human being anymore. She truly became just a figure of the monarchy. I think this was especially true as she got older and older. Unfortunately, I think this is also a cultural problem with how Westerners treat elderly people as well. Sometimes when people become elderly, they are no longer really seen as people and are only seen through this deficit lens of what they can't remember or can't do anymore. And elderly people often become infantilized by other people around them who start to believe that elderly people can't make any of their own decisions anymore, that they shouldn't have as much autonomy as they used to, that they can't be trusted to make good decisions for themselves. Although I think that is a problem with how we treat elderly people in general, With the Queen, I think it becomes even easier to make that argument because the monarch is pretty much a figurehead anyway and represents so much more than themselves. All royals, in a way, are meant to represent something much greater than themselves. But this dehumanization of these human beings who occupy these ceremonial roles should still not be treated as if they are not autonomous individuals. And as we've seen in multiple stories of royal family members, they tend to have to fight for their own personhood to be acknowledged, to be allowed to make decisions for themselves, and to build up autonomy and independence. Because in the cult, those things are not particularly looked favorably on. So for the Queen, with these courtiers like Young, her potential wants, feelings, desires becomes secondary to the upholding the institution angle, which I think is bound to attract a lot more psychopaths into the institution. And I think we've already got plenty of evidence that the institution is full of psychopaths. It does make a lot of sense that he would have been useful as a go-between for the government and for others to get the Queen the best deal, so to speak, in any negotiations, because it seems like his tactics and the tactics of a lot of other courtiers is just gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. But to do that to members of the Queen's own family, and remember, the royal family is meant to be the model family for Britain and the nation, it shows some weird hierarchy stuff that just screams nonsensical cult-like thinking that's about upholding the hierarchy above anyone's happiness within it. Speaking of gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss, Scobie also discusses Simon Case, a former courtier whose main principles were the Cambridges. The chapter ends with Scobie noting that Case eventually crawled back into British politics, into Rishi Sunak's cabinet. He had previously worked for Boris Johnson's administration, again with that revolving door between the monarchy and the government, the real government, so to speak, as if there's like literally any distinction at this point. But then Simon Case got implicated in the Boris Johnson Partygate scandal, which is just like hilarious. One quote from a Tory is just, "I like Simon, but he's a snake," which is basically all you really need to know about him. Like some of the other previous courtiers we've discussed, Case has also become an inner confidant and shit stirrer who focused the strategies of Kensington Palace on dirty tricks and widening cracks between various family members, rather than encouraging the family to put on a united front. On the topic of helping to rehabilitate William's work-shy Will's image, Scobie writes that Case's plan was to, quote, reposition William, the heir, as the responsible one, the adult in the room, while casting Harry, the spare, as the wayward one, the selfish brother with a competing agenda. Obviously, this sounds like a familiar trope at this point within the family. He gives an example of Case orchestrating an obvious PR stunt with the Cambridges to make them seem environmentally conscious after Harry and Meghan received public criticism in the press for flying in a private jet. Yes, somehow readers still fall for this shit, even though, as we have already noted, all these rich royal family members do not give an ounce of thought about the environmental impact of all of their private jet, helicopter, train, limo, and car journeys that they take constantly. And not only in the environmental impact, but the burden on the taxpayer that we saw in their reports for the last couple of years. So it's like, I truly do not understand why readers could be this dumb. But let's put it away. Let's put that away for now. It's almost like we should seize these from them and give them no power whatsoever. The whole thing fell flat, though, when it turned out that this PR stunt was somewhat co-opted by Flybe, the airline that they were using, who noted that this PR stunt was an opportunity for them to market their brand. So the airline sent over an empty plane to meet the Cambridges so that the photos of the plane would have their logo on it for the perfect branding opportunity, thus making the whole green thing once again totally bullshit when you factor in the cost of sending over an empty plane and then shipping that empty plane all the way back again. Like, literally do the math. 1 private jet plane journey versus 3 journeys for this 1 aircraft, 2 of which had a completely empty plane. Honestly, it is so frustrating how the royal family has like perfected the art of greenwashing their practices. The one thing they really want credit for is caring for the environment, but it is just another thing that they literally know fuck all about and refuse to make substantial changes to address. They are literally propagating ignorance about climate change and the impact of corporations and the 1% on the environment. I'm glad that Charles was into talking about climate change before it was cool, but now the climate crisis is here and the royal family literally just greenwashes all of their environmental events and charities and their behaviors to try to imply that they care so much about the environment when it's so obvious from their actions that they literally have no clue what would make a substantive impact on the climate crisis. It's so frustrating to me. It's like they want credit for this one thing so badly because they know it's not a political issue. Like, they won't get in trouble for like caring about animals and nature or whatever. But like, they literally don't care about animals and nature or whatever. They literally don't. Like, their actions, their behaviors, they say a lot of stuff about the environment, but they don't actually do a lot of things to make those things better. They basically just give pep talks to the world to tell us to change, but they don't change. It's so frustrating to me. But anyway, I'm not going to stay frustrated on that because we got more to talk about. So on to chapter 11. Chapter 11, Ghosts at the Feast. Hello, it's for you. It's Diana calling, and she is pissed. Okay, enough of the stupid props. In chapter 11, Ghosts at the Feast, Scobie discusses the way in which the royal family uses its power and influence to push narratives about Diana and her life, in particular by propping up aspects of her legacy that are marketable, such as her glamour and her fashion history, and silencing her own voice from the historical record. I think Scobie gives a great explanation as to why he decided to include Diana as a sort of figure on the chessboard, so to speak. Although Diana is no longer alive, she represents for the family a never forget moment in their history. Though Omid doesn't go so far as to say Diana's car crash is like the royal family's personal 9/11, I'm happy to make that comparison. National grief and tragedy, rife for conspiracy, beloved cultural icon, suddenly disappearing through unforeseen circumstances. People wondering what role bad policy played or weaknesses of certain beloved institutions, and a shock and a wake-up call on some dangerous practices. There was an obvious shift in British culture with Diana's passing, and with it, a shift in the media and the practices of the royal family. I don't want to get into a whole like rehashing of the Charles and Diana stuff, since, you know, I feel like it comes up in a lot of videos of mine, comes up in a lot of other content, but anyone that has long-term memory remembers that Diana in life was contentious both within and outside of the royal institution. She was a thorn in the side of many older members of the royal family, which by extension caused the push and pull between her and the media, often pulled in certain directions by the family's connections, and by Diana trying to carve out media for herself in order to find space for her own narrative to live. Yet with her death, it of course would seem uncouth to scold a dead woman. With this comes a strange tightrope to walk. How do you take all the parts of Diana that the average Joe or Josephine liked about her, while also still ignoring or downplaying the parts of her character which provoked questioning of the royal establishment. The most obvious thing that the firm wants to take from Diana is her place in fashion history. One, it's an easy thing from her memory to commodify. I mean, look at me. I got a Diana doll right here. My grandma bought so many outfits for this doll. I got another doll right over there. Fashion is literally a product, whether it be in doll form or human form. It is literally just capitalism, selling the products of the fashion industry. Two, it's an easy sell to the media to tug at heartstrings and continuously connect Diana's shine and glamour to other family members, some of whom desperately need it because they don't have their own.
Let me just sort of break down some of the things for you, which I found a bit fanciful, because he's discussing how the fact that Kate and Meghan were both told to dress like Diana so they could sort of have a bit of her star quality rub off on them, and even that Harry and William were consulted on such manners. And I think that this is sort of bordering on the fanciful, because of course fashion items and fashion trends come back into fashion by their very nature. I can't imagine ever be a situation where the two boys would have had that very bizarre conversation about how you'd like your wives to dress like your mothers.
Scobie writes, quote, "A former Kensington Palace staffer told me how a senior aide encouraged the then Duke and Duchess of Cambridge to make more nods to the princess on an overseas tour, from restaging iconic photographs taken on her travels to Kate mirroring her sartorial choices during poignant moments. During the past 13 years, Diana cosplay has become a royal staple. Aside from the clothing itself, Diana's imagery is also easily commodified in ways which benefit the family. I love Omid's wry commentary when he writes about Kensington Palace's sunken garden, which now houses a Diana statue. Quote, "Now visitors can stroll the gardens and reflect and celebrate the life of Princess Diana, hopefully also spending a little money in the nearby palace gift shop, complete with Diana-related memorabilia, or the on-site orangery, where you can indulge in afternoon tea overlooking the grounds where she once walked and chatted with gardeners. The family that once tormented this woman, caused all sorts of mental health crises with this woman, shunned her, denigrated her in the press, suddenly now they can make all the money that they want off of her branding and her image to benefit themselves without having to acknowledge any of the harm that they caused this woman. No need to acknowledge or repair any harm, any apology for basically being complacent in her death. Terrible. Absolutely terrible. In a broader sense, the family has also taken inspiration from Diana's approach to public engagements, again in the hopes that some shine will rub off on them. When Diana was introduced into the family, she was truly a breath of fresh air, probably because she was a young kid who hadn't been bathing in a terrible upbringing and bad PR advice since birth like the rest of the other royal family members. As a result, quote, "Public responded to this new personable royal style, which left other working royals looking cold and stiff. The palace took notice and eventually adopted her approach as a matter of company policy, and then other members followed her example. It's almost hard to believe that the royal family used to act more cold and stiff than they do today. Before Diana, royals recoiled at anything more personal than a handshake from a member of the public. Hell, remember when I told you that the Queen literally just leaving her car and walking near the crowds used to be a novel concept for the family? The Queen invented the idea of a walkabout, something that, again, is now company policy. But prior to the Queen, it was considered totally bizarre and too informal for royal family members to even breathe the same air as their subjects. Diana's huggy, touchy, feely nature, engaging with the crowd with more sort of warmth for the family at the time, was considered way too personal, way too much mingling with the unwashed masses. But yet again, her lead changed the company policy. And yet she didn't get any credit for that change. They just co-opted her style, but hated every single minute when she was actually doing it because she just did it better than all of them. Scobie also makes an excellent comparison between how the past and modern treatment of Diana and her legacy continues to be perpetuated in the firm's treatment of Meghan Markle, which is another way that, unfortunately, the legacy of Diana lives on into the present day. Quote, "In both Diana's and Meghan's cases, the institution showed it can be masters of PR sleight of hand, but it comes with tremendous fallout. Royal Family Inc. does not exactly have a spotless reputation for how it treats the women who enter into the family business." We've talked a lot on this channel about some of those parallels, but the two biggest ones I would highlight are, one, how Diana and Meghan are portrayed in the media, or were for Diana, as divas, entitled, fame hungry, media hungry, attention seeking, narcissistic. Even though it is clear, based on how the family tries to copy them endlessly, that they themselves can see that the media is only drawn to these women because they possess a natural charm and charisma and a good attitude that the royals simply lack. And two, the way the family refused to protect either of them from dangerous situations, especially after their rejections from the royal family. Because of the ruthlessness of the media and of the angry mobs of people fueled by half-truths and rage, and the fact that the family does this to women that have in some ways provided the one thing that the institution wants women to provide, which is children, shows that the system as a whole only sees these women as baby-making machines. They're not even concerned about protecting the life of that mother who has a relationship and a familial bond, the heirs and spares that they are putting out into the institution with their wombs. Meghan Markle brought a breath of fresh air into how royals could interact in their crowd work, in their engagements with the public. For Meghan, in the same way as Diana, those things came naturally and came from living experiences outside of the royal family's bubble and their conception of how to engage with the public. When Diana or Meghan Markle does those things, they're scolded for doing them because they are considered too informal, not royal enough, not dignified enough. But sure enough, they see that those tactics work. They see that the public enjoys those aspects. So they co-opt them and take those ideas as company policy, but they do not give any respect to the original women that conceived of those ideas and did those things naturally. Diana basically proved to the family that their methods were slow to progress to what the public was genuinely expecting from their leaders. A lesson that they didn't want to learn at the time, but now that she's not here to steal the spotlight from them, they are happy to engage with those ideas. So what does the firm not want us to remember about Diana's legacy? Pretty much any other part of her story. In fact, they actively censor her story, or try to do the classic fire hood of falsehoods and muddy the waters about her thoughts and feelings. Try to bring up every bad thing that Diana ever did to show that she's no angel, she isn't really that good. But anyway, we'll get to that. Scobie is incredibly critical of the family using their power to encourage the BBC, which is also state-owned media, by the way, like that. This should raise some alarm bells. This is literally media that is controlled by the government, to censor Diana's famous Panorama interview with Martin Bashir. In recent years, the family has become more brazen, spreading the same conspiracy that they have tried to push since Diana broke away from the family in the 90s. That Princess Diana was crazy, a paranoid woman whose criticisms of the institution stem from her mental health issues rather than with any problems with how the firm operates. They have used this paranoia argument to convince the public that Diana's own words should never be shown to the British public ever again. Quote, Prince William personally contacted BBC executives to take whatever steps were necessary to ensure that the interview never sees the light of day. According to one source, quote, they had no control over the Morton book, but this was something they hoped people would forget about. This investigation was the only way to secure that. They had no interest in doing it for Diana. It was all about removing what continues to be incredibly damaging to the monarchy from the public domain. It still baffles me that British people just casually accept this type of censorship. I actually had an entire script planned out for a video about the BBC and censorship. If I ever get enough time, I really would like to make that video. But the BBC has pretty consistently censored many different types of media, especially music. Gets brought up a lot. The BBC claims that it doesn't censor music anymore from their stations, but they do. But I think in the BBC's mind, they can rationalize this as somehow protecting a grieving family. Even if that family is laughing at you with £1 billion in their bank account, people just don't seem to care. It's interesting because I find that British people really don't trust any of their government institutions or any of their large institutions at all. They don't have any trust in the media. They don't have any trust in the government, any of their institutions at all. But then somehow they never really get upset when an institution is clearly doing something that is not in the public's best interest. Censorship is never in the public's best interest. I don't know. I find it very fascinating. Though there is indeed proof that Bashir used unsavory methods to acquire the interview, even the judge from the investigations about Bashir's conduct concluded, quote, Diana probably would have agreed to the interview without Bashir's unscrupulous inventions. Scobie highlights well that this is the exact same interview where Diana said that Charles, quote, might never be ready for the throne.
Royal liaison is a post within the BBC. During the time that I had been in that role, relations had always been extremely good. The system was working well. But when something of the nature of that particular documentary came along, it was evident that this was a fracture. This was a different area. This was revelatory in a sense that previous celebratory documentaries about the monarchy had been. This was not.
Most serious of all was Diana's verdict on the critical issue of Prince Charles and succession.
Being Prince of Wales produces more freedom now, and being king would be a little bit more suffocating. And because I know the character, I would think that the top job, as I call it, would bring enormous limitations to him. And I don't know whether he could adapt to that.
The palace were very upset. I mean, what they felt, I think, particularly was, we thought we had you are the BBC. We didn't think you would do a thing like this.
The argument for censoring this from the BBC actually stems from an investigation that was carried out that determined that Martin Bashir used nefarious tactics to forge documents to convince Diana that the family was doing certain things that weren't true, or that certain people within Diana's inner circle were receiving money for stories about her, which ended up not being true. The family argues that these tactics made Diana paranoid, and so therefore we cannot trust what she said in these interviews because of how the interview was organized. If you notice, none of that makes any sense with what Diana actually said in the interview. When Diana said that Charles might not be ready for the throne ever, it's not as if somehow Bashir's bad journalistic practices forced her to say that, and therefore it should never be repeated on the BBC. That literally just doesn't make any sense. It's not like when she said there are 3 in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded, that Martin Bashir's nefarious tactics forced those words out of her mouth. I also want to point out the absolute crazy hypocrisy of the family. We've seen before that the institution was unwilling to censor racist posts on their Instagram accounts because of their stupid American free speech argument. But somehow, in this case, we have to censor one of Diana's only public, honest, on the record interviews because the family maybe doesn't like what she thinks or thought. And yet they can make that argument that random shit posters on their Instagram have a right to free speech and therefore cannot be censored on Instagram of all places, when none of that has anything to do with like somebody's story and a historical record. Unless you're literally just hoping to preserve the record that a lot of your Instagram followers are racist, but like, why would you want to keep the evidence of that? Doesn't make any sense. It's just like, who cares if you like or don't like what Diana said in that interview? Or if you think that she might have said something different based on Bashir's actions. We don't have evidence of that, but let's just assume she would have said things differently. What does any of that have to do with preserving Diana's story in her own words? How does Bashir's actions in obtaining the interview have anything to do with whether or not we should show the final results of that interview? It's literally just an excuse for censorship, which makes me think that literally the concept of freedom of speech and censorship is absolutely meaningless in Britain. And you should get on that because, it is fucking Russia over there, basically. And with that, I think it's time for final thoughts. Thank you to listening to my thoughts on chapters 8 through 11 of Endgame. I need a break to talk about these issues because I have no other outlet in my real life to talk about how absolutely bonkers I think everything is right now with the royal family. I want to see where the political conversation goes, and I truly want something to click about how messy and wrong the entire structure of the British government is. It's not a freaking secret. Many Enlightenment thinkers and founding fathers have written tirelessly about why monarchy and a structure in which power coalesces into one individual is really bad for good governance. This is literally the first paragraph of Thomas Paine's 1776 revolutionary pamphlet, Common Sense. Quote, "Perhaps the sentiments contained in the following pages are not yet sufficiently fashionable to procure them general favor. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right, raises at first a formidable outcry in defense of custom, but the tumult soon subsides. Time makes more converts than reason." Later on, he writes, quote, "I know it is difficult to get over local or long-standing prejudices. Yet, if we will suffer ourselves to examine the component parts of the English Constitution, we shall find them to be the base remains of two ancient tyrannies, compounded with some new republican materials. First, the remains of monarchical tyranny in the person of the king. Secondly, the remains of aristocratical tyranny in the persons of the peers. Thirdly, the new republican materials in the persons of the commons, or whose virtue depends the freedom of England. The first two, by being hereditary, are independent of the people. Wherefore, in a constitutional sense, they contribute nothing towards the freedom of the state. To say that the Constitution of England is an union of three powers reciprocally checking each other is farcical. Either the words have no meaning or they are flat contradictions. There is something exceedingly ridiculous in the composition of monarchy. It first excludes a man from the means of information, yet empowers him to act in cases where the highest judgment is required. The state of a king shuts him from the world, yet the business of a king requires him to know it thoroughly. Wherefore the different parts, by unnaturally opposing and destroying each other, prove the whole character to be absurd and useless. Some writers have explained the English Constitution thus: The king, say they, is one, the people another. The peers are a house in behalf of the king, the commons in behalf of the people. But this hath all the distinctions of a house divided against itself. And though the expressions be pleasantly arranged, yet when examined they appear idle and ambiguous. And it will always happen that the nicest construction that words are capable of, when applied to the description of something which either cannot exist or is too incomprehensible to be within the compass of description, will be words of sound only, and though they may amuse the ear, they cannot inform the mind. For this explanation includes a previous question, viz., how came the king by a power which the people are afraid to trust and always obliged to check? Such a power could not be the gift of a wise people, neither can any power which needs checking be from God. Yet the provision which the Constitution makes supposes such a power to exist. The crown is this overbearing part in the English Constitution needs not be mentioned, and that it derives its whole consequence merely from being the giver of places and pensions is self-evident. Wherefore, though we have been wise enough to shut and lock a door against absolute monarchy, we at the same time have been foolish enough to put the crown in possession of the key. The prejudice of Englishmen in favor of their own government by king, lords, and commons arises as much or more from national pride than reason. We are seeing the effects of this right now with where real politics is going in the United Kingdom. Very little has changed from 1776 when Common Sense was written. The King and the House of Lords both act without any oversight from the people, and thus the conservative interests of both parties in the United Kingdom do nothing to serve the interests of the people within it. The only way for any change to exist in the British political structures is for Brits to adopt a new constitution, a new structure of governance. And the only way I believe that that's going to happen is if we critically examine the institution of the monarchy. The only way for Brits to thrive will be through the abolition of the monarchy. For some right now, the royal family is just idle gossip. It's celebrity tittle-tattle. That is not true. They are the linchpin in the entire English system of governance. Hold on for part 3 because we will continue to examine this, and you can be treated to all my ramblings on the last 4 chapters of the book. We did it. We made it. Thank you so much for watching. Please do me a favor. If you enjoyed this, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, hit that little bell icon, leave a comment. What do you think about this book? What are your thoughts on monarchy? Fight with me in the comments. I love it. Hope you have a good day. See you another time. Bye.
By the way, you be careful what you say now, because these guys, they're filming.
I know. And if you can see the camera, they can see you. And it's the least consequential part of this whole meeting for you. I promise. All right. God save the Queen, man.